Ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la la. La 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
It is good to see you all, and I'm glad the weather we had yesterday was not happening today for all sorts of reasons. We're going to begin with the lighting of Shabbat candles, which you can find in your Siddur, which is under the seat in front of you, on page 120. And Jen, if you would.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'chad ner shel Shabbat.
Thank you so much. We continue with the singing of Yedid Nefesh, a piyutis, a poem written in the 16th century in Sfat, in the land of Israel, among a burgeoning community of mystics who imagined the arrival of Shabbat as the arrival of a bride to the wedding canopy. And that's why we sing Lecha Dodi, to you, the beloved. It's on page 128.
Please join me. Yedid nefesh av harachaman, av harachaman. Meshochavtecha el retzonecha, el retzonecha. Yarutz avdecha kemo ayal yishtachave el muladarecha. Yedid nefesh av harachaman, av harachaman. Meshochavtecha el retzonecha, el retzonecha.
On page 138, we have arrived at the singing of Yedid Nefesh. Everything I said about, Lecha Dodi, everything that I said about Yedid Nefesh before actually refers to this, not to Yedid Nefesh, but we'll get it straight one day. We customarily sing the first, second, fifth, and ninth stanzas, and when we arrive to the ninth stanza, it's customary to rise and face the door as we symbolically welcome the spirit of Shabbat.
Lecha dodi likrat kala, pnei Shabbat nekabela. 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 Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad, Yishmianu el hamiyuchad, Adonai echad u'shemo echad, L'shem ultiferet v'litila. Lecha dodi likrat kala, pnei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha dodi likrat kala, pnei Shabbat nekabela. Verse 2. Likrat Shabbat lechu v'nelecha, ki hine kor habracha, merosh mikedem nesucha, sof ma'aseh b'machshavat chila. Lecha dodi likrat kala, pnei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha dodi likrat kala, pnei Shabbat nekabela. Verse 5. Hitoreri, ki va'orech kumi ori, uri shir daberi, kevod Adonai alayich nigla. Lecha dodi likrat kala, pnei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha dodi likrat kala, pnei Shabbat nekabela. Boi v'shalom ateret bala, gam besimcha u'tzola, toch emunei am segula. Boi chala, lecha dodi likrat kala, pnei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha dodi likrat kala, pnei Shabbat nekabela.
Please remain standing as we turn to page 144, as the cantor leads us in the Reader's Kaddish.
Yitgadal v'kadash shemei Rabbah.
Amen.
Be'alma divrach chiruteh v'yamlich malchuteh. B'chayechon u'v'yomechon u'v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael. Bakala u'vizman kariv yimiru. Amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevarach, le'alam u'lal me'am haya, yitbarach, יתברך וישתבח, ויפאר ותרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה, ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו, לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, דמירן בעלמא ויאמרו אמן.
Page 146.
Yai la 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 la. Yai la 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 la. Yai la 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 la. Yai la 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 la. Yai la 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 la. Yai la 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 la. Yai la 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 la. Yai la 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 la. Baruchu et Adonai HaMevorach. Baruch Adonai HaMevorach, HaMevorach le'olam va'ed. HaMevorach, HaMevorach le'olam va'ed.
And let's continue together praying at the top of page 147. There is one who sings the song of his own life, finding everything within himself. There is one who leaves the circle of herself and sings the song of her people. There is one whose voice rings with a song of humanity,
hoping for the highest perfection. And there is one who rises even higher, uniting with all creatures, with all worlds, filling the universe with song.
Page 149. Praise to you, please join me, Adonai our God, from
Whom the evening flows. Your wisdom sets the way on which time and season glide. Your breath guides the sail of the stars. Creator of the tide of time and light, you guide the current of day into night. As heaven spans to infinity, you set its course for eternity. Praise to you, Adonai our God, from whom the evening flows. Baruch atah Adonai, Ha'ma'ariv Aravim.
Page 150.
Ahavat olam Beit Yisrael Amecha Ahavta Torah u'mitzvot Chukim u'mishpatim Otanu limadeta Alekein Adonai Eloheinu b'shochveinu Uvkumeinu nasiach bechukecha V'nismach b'divrei Toratecha Uv'mitzvotecha le'olam va'ed Ki heim chayenu Ve'orech yameinu Uvahem nege yomam v'layla Nege yomam v'layla Ve'ahavatecha al tasir Mimenu le'olamim Baruch atah Adonai Yisrael, Ohev Amo Yisrael. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Le'olam Vaed.
Please be seated, and we continue on page 154.
ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך. והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובשוכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם לאות על ידיך והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך, למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותי והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם לאלוהים. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אדוני אלוהיכם אמת.
We continue together at the top of 157. Standing on the departed shores of history,
we still believe what we were taught before ever we stood at Sinai's foot, that wherever we go, it is eternally Egypt, that there is a better place, a promised land, that the winding way to that promise passes through the wilderness, that there is no way to get from here to there except by joining hands and marching together.
Page 158.
Yai lai 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 yai lai 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 ya lai 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 yai lai 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 ya lai 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 ya lai 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 yai lai 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 lai. Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, mi kamocha nedar b'kodesh, nora tehilot osefele, osefele. Malchutcha ra'u vanecha, bokei hayam lifnei Moshe u'Miriam. Malchutcha ra'u vanecha, bokei hayam lifnei Moshe u'Miriam. Seili hanu ve'ameru, Adonai imloch, leolam, leolam va'ed. Yala lai 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 lai, yala lai lai lai, yala lai 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 lai, yala lai lai, yala lai 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 lai, yala lai lai lai, yala lai 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 lai. ונאמר כי פרד אדוני את יעקב וגאלו מיד חזק ממנו. ברוך אתה אדוני גאל ישראל.
Let's continue praying together on page 161. Let there be love and understanding among us. Let peace and friendship be our shelter from life's storms. Adonai, help us to walk with good companions, to live with hope in our hearts and eternity in our thoughts, that we lie down in peace and rise up waiting to do your will. Baruch atah Adonai, hapores sukat shalom, aleinu ve'al kol amo Yisrael, ve'al Yerushalayim.
ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. ביני ובין בני ישראל, ביני ובין בני ישראל, עוד היא לעולם, עוד היא לעולם. ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. כי ששת ימים, כי ששת ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ, ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. וביום השביעי שבת וינפש, ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם.
On page 164, we rise, if you're comfortable doing so, and continue with the central portion of prayer, the Amidah.
Adonai sefatai tiftach ufi ki tehilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips, that my mouth may declare your praise. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu ve'Elohei Avoteinu ve'Imoteinu, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, ve'Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, ve'Elohei Leah, Ha'el Hagadol, Hagibor v'Hanora, El Elyon, Gomel Chasadim Tovim, וקונה הכל, וזוכר חסדי אבות ואימהות, ומביא גאולה לבני בניהם, למען שמו באהבה. מלך עוזר ומושיע ומגן, ברוך אתה אדוני, מגן אברהם ועזרת שרה. אתה גיבור לעולם אדוני, מחיי הכל אתה רב להושיע, משיב הרוח ומוריד הגשם, מכלכל חיים בחסד, מחיי הכל ברחמים רבים, סומך נופלים ורופא חולים, ומתיר אסורים, ומקיים אמונתו לשני עפר, מי כמוך בעל גבורות ומיתו מלך, מלך ממית ומחיה ומצמיח ישועה, ונאמן אתה להחיות הכל. ברוך אתה אדוני מחיי הכל. אתה קדוש בשמך קדוש, וקדושים בכל יום יהללוך סלה. ברוך אתה אדוני האל הקדוש.
Please be seated. And let's continue together at the top of page 173. We'll continue on at the top of the next two odd number pages, 175 and 177. And on page 178, we will have arrived at the end of the Amidah, which is the prayer for peace, Shalom Rav. So let's continue together on 173. May these hours of rest and renewal open our hearts to joy and our minds to truth. May all who struggle find rest on this day.
May all who suffer find solace. May all who hurt find healing on this day. May all who despair find purpose. May all who hunger find fulfillment on this day. And may this day fulfill its promise. Baruch atah Adonai, Mekadesh HaShabbat.
Ever-present one,
May we, your people Israel, be worthy in our deeds and our prayers. Wherever we live, wherever we seek you, in this land, in Zion restored, in all lands, you are our God, whom alone we serve in reverence. Baruch atah Adonai, she'otcha levadcha b'yirah na'avod.
God of goodness, we give thanks for the gift of life,
Wonder beyond words, for the awareness of soul, our light within, for the world around us so filled with beauty, for the richness of the earth which day by day sustains us. For all these and more, we offer thanks. Baruch atah Adonai, hatov shimcha ulecha na'eh lehodot. Shalom Rav al Yisrael amcha tasim leolam. Shalom Rav al Yisrael amcha tasim leolam. Ki ata hu melech adon lechol Shalom, ki ata hu melech adon lechol hashalom. Shalom Rav al Yisrael amcha tasim leolam. Shalom Rav al Yisrael amcha tasim leolam. V'tov b'einecha levarech et amecha Yisrael b'chol eit u'v'chol shah b'shlomecha. Shalom Rav al Yisrael amcha tasim leolam. Shalom Rav al Yisrael amcha tasim leolam. Tasim leolam. Tasim leolam.
Baruch atah Adonai havarech et amo Yisrael b'shalom. Blessed are you, Adonai. You bless your people, and God willing, all people everywhere with peace. We continue our prayers silently.
Yiuler at son imre fi. Yiuler at son imre fi. Fegion libi lefanecha. Adonai tzuri vegoali. Oh, may the words of my mouth, the meditations of my heart be acceptable before you, O God, my rock and my redeemer. Ose shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'imru, ve'imru, Amen.
On page 371 of the Siddur, you'll find the Mishaberach prayer for healing. There are numerous blessings that start with Mishaberach because it really means, may the one who blessed our ancestors also bless us. And there is a form of the Mishaberach for people who have returned from a long trip. There's the form of a Mishaberach for people, women in particular, who have just given birth. There's a Mishaberach for almost every possible event in life. But we offer Mishaberach on Shabbat for healing for those of our friends and relatives who could use such a blessing. We think especially the Shabbat of Bill Ross, Katie Peltz Davis, Alan Turner, Bob Ransom, Patrice R., Michelle Jacoby, Catherine Lamb, Bob Ratke, Maccabee Ben Avraham, Kathleen Manchero, Al Myers, Jack Marvin, Donald Metzke, Cindy Kramer, Jim Stillman, Janelle C., Ruth Lowenstein, Natalie Winowich, Carolyn Berman, Leonora Friedman, Tracy Weiser, Judith Heldman, Marcia Reese, Jean and Paul Wilhelm, Bill Reed, Sarah Friedman, Leo Weinschel, David Goldenholtz, Le Nachama Bat Faya, Sarah Bat Bessie Viben, Rivka Fegi Bat Phyllis, Jennifer Houston, Fievel Ben Rachalea, David Warner, Linda Roberts Greenblatt, Neil Pinsky, Lular Hughes, Gene Redman, Dietem Itter, Barbara Blick, Herb Selden, Michael Ross, Michael and Kathy Keeley, Jen Volker, Debbie Guidan, Marilyn and Michael Stillman, William Frankie, Joseph Marcus, Carol Willems, Mike Johnson, Doug Lewis, Susie Garrison, Deidre Tischberg, Rivka Bracha Bat Basha Pesha, David Rector, Karen Horwitz, Bill Nicode, Rick Nybor, Bracha Bat Miriam, Charles Young, Avram Ben Baris, Herb Bratt, Truth Sophia Freeman, Marlene Levy, Zisa Elka Bat Chassia, Bob Neubauer, Carol Para, Madeline Para, and Jimmy Ansfield. I would add to that Samuel Fox, Mike Deans, Cecilia Tenorio, Gloria Krasno, and Sam Sugarman. And if there are others of whom you're aware could use our blessings for healing, I would ask you please to hold them close to you in your heart as together we pray.
Mi sheperach avoteinu mekor habracha leimotenu. May the source of strength, who bless the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say Amen. Mi sheberach imotenu mekor habracha lavotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shalema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say Amen.
As some of you may know, I just returned last Thursday night from a 10-day sojourn in Israel, a place I love, a place where I worked for several years after college, a place from which Avner just returned. When did you get back? Monday. Oh, you should be, no jet lag. Somewhere in there. It was, the occasion of my going there was the yearly meeting of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the Reform Rabbis Group, which every 7 years or so, COVID notwithstanding, tries to meet in Israel. This year, for the first time, or maybe the second time, we didn't spend all of our time in Jerusalem, but split it up between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. At the conclusion of the conference, I spent 3 days in the West Bank staying and visiting with Palestinian families. My visit to the West Bank was organized by a group called J Street, formed years ago as an alternative to the increasingly conservative AIPAC, American Israel Public Affairs Committee. I really, to be quite honest, was not a fan of J Street initially, in large part because its founder has been given at times to issue statements I felt were inaccurate and sometimes bordering on offensive. For example, this is one that really pushed me over the edge. He once quipped describing the American relationship with Israel back in 2008, said, "It's time to act like the big brother or the parent and to say, enough is enough. We're going to take the car keys if you don't stop driving drunk." I thought, I got it, but I thought that was a little bit much. Despite my initial rejection of J Street, I've become more open to their mission, which is to, like AIPAC, to work with Congress to support Israel, although they're coming from a slightly different direction than AIPAC is. I've become more accustomed to J Street principally because of two changes. The first is that AIPAC changed last year from having been an advisory group to becoming an actual PAC, distributing dollars to actual candidates, among whom, to my horror, were several who participated in the January 6th insurrection. Secondly, Israel's current government consists of politicians who are drunk with power, and as we've been reminded for years, friends don't let friends drive drunk. And it really does pain me to say so. But tonight I want to report on the segment of my trip to Israel. As I was writing this out, I realized that if I tried to address both the week in Israel and the 3 days in the West Bank, we'd be here till morning. So instead, I'm going to defer that second topic to next week because it really does deserve its own place. Israel is going through an unprecedented period of upheaval, a revolution which some have taken to labeling an Israeli spring, like that which upended the Arab world a few decades ago. The presenting issue is the government led by Benjamin Netanyahu, which includes several ministers who in the past have been forbidden to sit in the Knesset, Israel's parliament, because of their racist views and occasional actions. Like some American politicians we know from our national life, Netanyahu is not particularly an ideologue. He really cares mostly about remaining in power, in part to avoid serving jail time for crimes for which he is now on trial. To form a ruling coalition, Netanyahu had to make common cause with several particularly bad actors, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich. Both grew up in the settler movement in the West Bank, and I mean grew up from childhood, among those who were dubbed back then the Hilltop Youth, so named because they would occasionally occupy hilltops in the West Bank to build illegal settlements. Both are Orthodox and live in a bubble that stretches back to June of 1967. When Israel prevailed that year in the Six-Day War against multiple Arab armies bent on its destruction, it was left occupying Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, Syria's Golan Heights, and Jordan's West Bank. The Sinai was returned to Egypt in 1979 as part of a peace agreement. The Golan Heights will probably never be returned in its entirety because it's very important not to have people sitting up above all the kibbutzim in the north able to just shoot down at them and lob things. And the West Bank was initially, in the weeks and months following the Six-Day War, was the object of intense talk in Israel about when and how to return sovereignty to its inhabitants. Jordan, home to a country of around 70%, a little more now probably, of whom are Palestinians, is ruled by a king whose family originates elsewhere in the Middle East, which is not an uncommon pattern. But he realized he didn't need more Palestinians. So he renounced any interest in the West Bank, even though he had been the power controlling it since 1948. A good move on King Hussein's part, because 3 years later, in 1970, the Palestinians had become such a threat to him, he expelled them from Jordan, and they then relocated to southern Lebanon. Some argued in Israel at the time that at least the area immediately west of the Jordan River would need to stay in Israeli hands for security purposes. Others argued a similar point, that ceding the high ground, and the West Bank is mostly built on hills and mountains, would constitute another security threat. As the debate continued, the occupation became entrenched. Though there was no fence or barrier on the border of the West Bank, there was a definite divide. In the West Bank, Palestinians were subject to military law and military administrative control, unlike their Arab cousins who lived in Israel who enjoyed full citizenship rights. And when Jews began to erect settlements in the West Bank, the Jewish residents there were subject to Israeli law, even though their neighbors right next door were living under military occupation. Security, though, was not the only motivation for repopulating the West Bank. When Israel won the Six-Day War, miraculously, religious Jews saw an indication that this was a sign of the coming of the Messiah. Accordingly, they made plans to settle the West Bank. In fact, many of the initial settlements were built on the ruins of Jewish towns that were destroyed in the War of Independence in 1948, and were then in 1967 repopulated by those who had left those towns as children back in 1948. And it does seem that Messianism is always in fashion in one form or another. A growing minority within the religious community in Israel feels that settling the West Bank is a necessary precondition for the coming of the Messiah. And their enthusiasm has a bit of a rationale to it. After all of biblical history really took place on the area we now call the West Bank. Hebron, Beit El, Jerusalem. Nothing really happened in the Bible in Tel Aviv and Haifa, which didn't exist at the time. A concomitant desire of a small but vocal group of the Messianists is having the state of Israel be governed by halakha, Jewish law. That is unlikely to happen anytime soon, if at all. But whenever there is a conflict between Jewish law and democracy, this particular small group favors the former and dismisses the latter. And now that group has extremist representation, not only in the Israeli government, but on the cabinet itself, tasked with overseeing the police and the security situation in the West Bank. They are also, as we've seen in other countries around the world, using the tools of democracy to undermine democracy. The issue currently at hand is whether and when the Israeli Supreme Court can conduct judicial review and amend or nullify laws passed by the Knesset if they deem them inconsistent with Israel's body of what's called the Basic Laws, which is kind of a constitution under construction. The founders of the state couldn't decide. They thought having a constitution would be important. They couldn't decide what God's place was going to be in the document. So instead, case law has built up over time, particularly around civil rights, and that is called the Basic Law, and it requires a super majority to do anything to it. And the Supreme Court has really been the force in Israel which has provided an alternative, or perhaps a curb, to some of the messianic zeal of the religious. It turns out, though, most Israelis really don't want a weakening of democratic norms. Over the past several months, the last 2 months to be clear, increasingly larger crowds of demonstrators have assembled every night all over the country to protest the attack on democracy. Last Saturday night, for example, more than 300,000 Israelis came out into the streets. And was that the night you were out, Avner? Avner was visiting in the north of Israel, but there too, everywhere there were people out in the streets. And just for comparison's sake, if you transpose those numbers into the American population, you're talking about 18 to 20 million people being out in the streets. It's a really unprecedented number, certainly in Israel and lots of places, of people protesting. Every day, a different group has taken the lead on organizing the demonstrations, including students, members of unions, reserve officers in the army, former heads of the Mossad and the Israel Defense Forces. Artists are canceling performances to enable people to demonstrate. Every Israeli male, after 3 years of compulsory army service, does reserve duty for a number of years, usually a few weeks a year. And a significant number of them, some of them of quite high rank, have said they will not follow call-up orders issued by this government. So too many reserve combat pilots who refuse to train until the situation is resolved. Here's an excerpt from one of the Israeli daily papers just a couple of days ago. The IDF, in its infinite wisdom, on Thursday, I guess it was yesterday, provided the protest movement against the regime coup with its first folk hero. Colonel Gilad Peled, one of the ranking combat pilots of the Air Force, is almost an unexpected hero. The Israel Defense Force's decision to remove him from active service in the reserves, officially it's only a suspension, only intensifies the storm among the Air Force's reservists. Instead of extinguishing the fire, the IDF has added fuel to it, displaying a failure to grasp the far-reaching implications. P.S., by the way, today, after there was some uproar, the head of the Air Force reversed that decision and put him back on active reserve status. I read today a comment from Yossi Klein Halevi. Some of you have read his book. Some of you have met him in person when he's spoken in the community. He wrote about his experience at one of these demonstrations, which turned out to have a real downpour during it. Quote, "I've never been so drenched in my life, and I have never felt so moved. It was one of the most powerful Israeli experiences, spiritual Israeli experiences that I've ever had. Everyone was drenched to our underwear, and there was the sense of, we're not moving. Suddenly you looked around and you felt this sense of uplift." I'm describing a civil revolt of sorts, and yet it's a very hopeful thing. Israel is not the kind of place that, God forbid, would open fire on its citizens, live fire, to control this kind of uprising. It's not China, it's not Russia, God knows. But the people in charge, politicians, are not happy about what's going on. They're labeling the demonstrators as anarchists. I mean, people with baby carriages are generally not anarchists in a classic sense. For the most part, the demonstrations have not been violent. Just this past week, a group of protesters occupied a number of major highways in Israel, including the Ayalon, which stretches north from Tel Aviv and is a major artery, and Route 1, which is the major trunk that connects Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Yesterday, demonstrators shut down all the entrances to Ben Gurion Airport, forcing Netanyahu to take a helicopter from Jerusalem to Ben Gurion in order to fly to Israel, where he was going to be doing some diplomatic stuff, evidently. The government is trying to force their legislation through, and they do have, on paper, the political power to do so, but they're playing a very, very, very dangerous game. This may sound somewhat familiar, inasmuch as we have been subject here in the U.S. to politicians for whom democratic norms seem never to be at the top of their list of priorities. What hasn't yet happened here is the sort of popular uprising now seen in Israel. For me, this widespread activism really is a sign of hope. Would that here we could motivate people to take as much as an interest to protest some of the iniquities in our own society. The situation continues to move and change. Last night, 3 events occurred in rapid sequence, illustrating the scope of the crisis and also how quickly things can turn on a dime. First, Netanyahu's extremist national security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, dismissed Tel Aviv's police chief, apparently for not using enough force against demonstrators who have for weeks, in growing numbers and with growing desperation, been protesting the proposed legal overhaul. Israel's Attorney General suspended the move, citing potential illegalities. And frankly, that's not his role. He sort of forced the national head of the police to fire this guy in Tel Aviv, which is not so great. Immediately thereafter, President Isaac Herzog appeared on television for just about 5 minutes and employed apocalyptic terms to describe the existential disaster about to befall Israel. The country, he said, was, quote, at the point of no return, about to, quote, fall off a cliff. Its political leadership needed to, quote unquote, take responsibility and act now. Quote, if you choose the path you have followed thus far, the chaos will be on you. History will judge you. Herzog was focused on the coalition's program to neuter the judiciary and give the legislature and really the executive branch, so to speak, all of the power. And Herzog, who actually has pretty good credentials, was his father the originator of the Air Force in Israel? I can't remember what he did, but his father was like a luminary a generation ago. So Herzog has been trying for the last few weeks to put together some kind of consensus. But it's very difficult because one side will not keep moving forward in this process to pass the law. The other side says, we're not going to sit down to discuss anything until you stop doing that. We're not going to have a conversation as you're passing the law. Herzog thinks that there needs to be a plan with consensus. Practically, the moment Herzog finished his remarks, a young Palestinian opened fire on Tel Aviv's Dizengoff Street, shooting 3, one of whom was critically wounded. It then fell to the chief of police of Tel Aviv, whose dismissal had been announced with immediate effect, to nonetheless oversee his force's handling of the incident. You can see how things fall apart in this way. As I mentioned earlier, it had been my intent originally to also speak about my time in the West Bank, and there's not time to address both adequately. And so I'll defer discussion of my visit there to next week. One reason for doing so, aside from the lack of time tonight, is that it really deserves its own space, that conversation. Yet in truth, the connection between what is happening in Israel right now and has been happening in the West Bank are inextricably tied up together. I'll leave you with this anecdote. One of the things I noticed at the demonstrations was that everyone was focused on this issue of democracy. And when you said, well, what about the West Bank? How does the occupation play into this? The answer was, well, that's different. It's complicated. It's related to security and defense. And this was the response even after settlers had enacted what everyone in Israel called this past week a pogrom, setting fire to homes and vehicles in a village called Hawara in the northern West Bank, the home of 2 young men who that same night had shot and killed 2 Israeli civilians. The minister in charge of security in the West Bank, Bezalel Smotrich, then publicly called for Hawara to be erased from the map. He quickly tried to walk that back, but that's exactly what he meant. There's this, the attractiveness of collective punishment is something that is just, one branch of the moral issues at play. From where I stand, even though the Israelis didn't see why these things are connected in terms of demonstrating, there's really an undeniable connection between the occupation and the current attacks on democracy. It's found by the fact that Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who grew up in the West Bank, in the Hilltop Youth, are now in the government, and not only in the government, also in the cabinet. Had there not been, put it this way, without the occupation, there would not have been the Hilltop Youth. Without the Hilltop Youth, we wouldn't have Ben-Gvir and Smotrich in the government, by all likelihood. Ergo consum. I hope you'll be with us next Shabbat when I talk about my experiences in the West Bank, which will be less about history and more about, kind of human conversation and interaction. The West Bank is a place I've been many times before, but it affected me this time in a different, and I might say devastating way. So Shabbat Shalom. We're going to conclude services first with the Aleinu, which you can find on page 586 of the Siddur. Please rise and join us in facing the ark.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגורלנו ככל המונם, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו
On page 598, you can find the Mourner's Kaddish. We think especially the Shabbat of Dr. Hermes Hoffman, who was just laid to rest this week, and Nick Winowich, who died during the past month. The following, who have members of our congregation saying Kaddish for them, and this is the year following the death: Leanne Borkovitz, Tom St. John, Morty Blutstein, Barbara Wyman, Ralph Gorin, Edith Lank, Susan Melanie Siegel, Don Polachek, Biv Colton, Brian Spring, Ruthie Zabotsky, Jay Aronoff, Alan Rieselbach, Esther Stein Tiny Arnold, Rosemary Bloom, Elmer Gary Martin, James Goodman, Jan Goldberg, Bobby Driggett, Evelyn Garfinkel, Judith Selinsky, Brian Robert Ellis, Janet Joyce Meister, Rosalie Kahn, Harry Wallace, Ted Roth, Don Styler, Elsie Kanan, and Doji Sherman. And we recall those whose yahrzeit or yearly anniversary of death falls this week: Natalie Bodenskaya, Lawrence Bodner, Arnold Borkin, Pearl Brown, Beatrice Chudnow, my grandmother Gertrude Cohn, Alice Ruth Culp, Max Engel, Nicole Hirsch, Leopold Jacobs, Del Crom, Hyman Labotsky, Roger Yale Pokras, Raymond Ratner, Saul Oscar Raidman, Ruth Rich, Marty Taylor Roach, Anna Rosenblum, Bertie Schneider, Irene Strauss, Cy Taylor, Arthur Tiber, Muriel Tolkien, Rabbi Elliot Waldman, Sigmund Winter, and Joel Wolfson. And if there's anyone here who is mourning the recent passing of a friend or a loved one, or is observing the yahrzeit anniversary of a loved one's death whose name I didn't mention, I would ask you please to share those names aloud with us at this point. Steve?
Phil Oskowski passed away this week, friends.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sammy Christie.
We take all of them into our hearts. And your brother.
I went through the condolences to my brother, grandson, died in college. Three high school.
Avner, what was his name?
Daniel Ari.
Thank you. We take all of them into our hearts as together we recite Kaddish.
Yitgadal v'yitkadash Shemei Rabbah. B'alma divrach chilutei v'yamlich malchutei. V'chayechon v'yomechon uv'chayei d'chol Beit Yisrael. Ba'gala uv'izman kariv v'imru. Amen. Yehei Shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam olal me'al maya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yithalal Shemei d'Kudusha B'richu. La'ela min kol birchata v'shirata. Tushbechata v'nechemata. Da'amiran be'alma v'imru. Amen. Yehei Shlama Rabba min Shemaya. V'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav. Hu ya'aseh shalom. Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen.
May the source of peace, who makes peace in the highest heavens, enable us to learn how to make peace here on earth. And may God share with those in mourning a measure of consolation and comfort. And together we say,
Amen.
Please be seated. You're in, Coach. Okay. Mention this. It doesn't say, but mention that it's in spirituality.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Shabbat Shalom. Announcements for today. We are grateful for the contributions made this week to our Sinai community in the memory of Joel Wolfson, Raymond Ratner, Anna Rosenblum, Nicole Hirsch, Martha Taylor Roach. Please join us for the following upcoming programs. Achino, which is the men's spirituality group. I see some members here today. It's an awesome activity. It's meeting this Sunday at 8:30. Itzi Bitsy Sinai Reich and Ruach, right? Okay, good. Meets this Sunday at 10:15 a.m. Okay, calling all teens. Jewish Teen Resource Fair this Sunday from 2 to 4 p.m. at Sinai. And next week, Barat Nashim is Monday, March 13th via Zoom. Passover Seder, that's coming up, I can't believe. Passover Seder workshop on Thursday, March 16th at 7 p.m. via Zoom. Please join Rabbi Cohn for Shabbat. Vayinafash, that's what I said, Vayinafash, on Saturday, March 18th at 10:30 a.m. for special Shabbat morning prayer drawing from mindfulness practices such as meditation. Sinai Brotherhood presents The Politics of Marvel's Cinematic Universe, edited by Nicholas Carnes and Lily Gorin, who's a board member, on Sunday, March 19th at 10 a.m., RSVP via e-news. Thank you.
You know, there's a section of the Haggadah at Passover that has this long list of rabbis with unpronounceable names. And no matter how you try to situate people around the table, the person who ends up having to read that part, they're doomed. I mean, it's very tough. Thank you, Steve, very, very much. We're going to bless Kiddush wine. You can find the blessing on page 123, and please rise.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'ratzavanu v'shabbat kodsho b'yahava uvratzon inchilanu zikaron lema'aseh v'reishit. Ki hu yom techila lemikrai kodesh zecher litziat Mitzrayim. Ki vanu v'acharta ve'otanu kidashta mikol ha'amim ve'shabbat kodshecha ve'ahava uv'ratzon hinchaltanu. Baruch atah Adonai Mekadesh HaShabbat L'chaim.
Chaim. And please join us in the Motzi.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz b'tei avon.
Before you go, we like to think of this place as a warm and welcoming one. But the fact of the matter is we have to sort of exercise those muscles with some frequency to make it actually real. So on your way in to the Oneg, into the reception, I would ask you please to find somebody here you don't know and introduce yourself to them. And that way we can further that sense of inclusion and bringing people together. So Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
That says real men marry guys. So I know that's a thing.